The thing that still bothers me most isn't what I saw. It's the moment just before I saw it, when my brain was still trying to make it something ordinary. I've been doing pest control in Northwest Ohio for going on 19 years. I've crawled under houses in January, pulled dead raccoons out of walls by feel alone, and worked through enough late-night calls that the dark stopped meaning anything to me a long time ago. I don't get rattled. That's not a boast. It's just a job. You stop being scared of the dark when the dark is where you work. I almost didn't tell this story, not because I thought people wouldn't believe me. I'm past caring about that. I didn't tell it because the telling means sitting back inside that moment, and there are parts of that moment I've spent the better part of a year trying to compress into something small enough to carry. My name is Jason. I'm 47 years old, married, 2 kids out of the house, which means my wife and I rattle around a 4-bedroom place in a town of 6,000 people, and I spend my days driving county roads in a white truck with a phone number on the side, solving problems most people don't want to think about. I am not someone who sees things. That's the part that matters. That's the part I need you to understand before anything else. The job that brought me to that parking lot on a Thursday night in late October was about as unremarkable as pest control gets. A grocery store on the edge of the county had been losing trash. Not losing it, having it redistributed. 3 nights in a row, the dumpsters behind the store were torn open, bags dragged out. Produce and cardboard and foam trays spread across the concrete pad and into the grass beyond. The store manager, a guy named Phil, who'd been running that location for about 11 years and had the gray hair to prove it, wasn't panicking about the wildlife. He was panicking about his next health inspection. I'd met Phil twice before on a mouse problem the previous winter. He was the kind of man who kept a legal pad on his desk and wrote things down in columns. Practical, calm, not given to drama. When he called me about the dumpsters, he described the situation in bullet points and asked what I needed from him. I told him I'd set trail cameras and a couple of live traps, check on them in a few days, and report back. He said fine, thanked me, and hung up. That's the version of the world I was living in when I drove out there that Thursday, a reasonable problem with a reasonable solution. I finished a mouse job across town around 8:30, stopped at the gas station by the highway for coffee I didn't need, and headed out. The store sat on a stretch of road that does what a lot of Northwest Ohio roads do. It runs commercial for about a quarter mile and then just stops. You've got a pharmacy, a dollar store, the grocery, and then nothing. The pavement keeps going, but the development doesn't, and within a few hundred yards, you're looking at scrub brush and second-growth woods that run down toward a creek and then open up into heavier forest, miles of it. The kind of land that doesn't show up on anyone's development plan because it's too wet and too low and not worth the trouble. The store itself closed at 10. When I pulled in around 8:50, the parking lot out front was almost empty. 3 cars near the entrance, a shopping cart abandoned at a diagonal in one of the spaces, the kind of small evidence of a quiet night. The store's rooftop HVAC units were running, putting out that flat mechanical hum that becomes invisible after about 30 seconds. Overhead, the sky was sealed solid with cloud cover, no moon getting through. The sodium vapor light on the pole at the back corner of the lot threw an orange wash across the near half of the rear parking area and then gave up. Beyond the dumpster corral, a 3-sided cinder block enclosure bolted to the back of the building, the light just stopped. I parked with the truck facing out, which is habit, grabbed my coffee, grabbed my flashlight. The small one was in the cup holder. I looked at it, thought about the distance between the truck and the enclosure and the fact that there was no useful light back there, and went behind the seat for the big one instead. I've learned that lesson often enough that it's automatic now. The walk from the truck to the enclosure takes maybe 40 seconds. Down the side of the building, past a loading dock with its overhead door rolled shut, around the corner. The smell of the dumpsters hits you before you see them. Produce waste and cardboard and a particular sweetness of meat packaging that's been sitting in the heat of a closed bin and then cooled overnight. Familiar, unremarkable. I turned the corner and stopped. The left dumpster lid was standing open. That was wrong for 2 reasons. I always close them when I leave, part of the methodology so you can track whether something has been back, and Phil had confirmed his staff was doing the same. The lid was steel and heavy, not something wind moves. I stood just inside the edge of the enclosure and listened. The ambient sound was what I'd expect. Highway hum in the distance, the rooftop units, a car somewhere out front. But under all of that was something I noticed only because I was standing still and paying attention. Nothing. No night insects, no frog noise from the drainage ditch along the back fence line. Earlier in October, you still get some of that. That night, there was none. I'd been around enough outdoor environments to know what it means when the small things go quiet. It means something is in the area that the small things have decided to avoid. Coyote usually. Sometimes a barn owl working low. I told myself coyote and stepped forward. The smell changed about 4 feet inside the enclosure. The dumpster smell was still there. It's not like that goes anywhere. But under it was something else. Something that hadn't been there 2 nights ago when I set the cameras. A wet animal smell. The kind that comes off a large mammal that's been moving hard, like the underside of a dog that's been running in the rain, but heavier, darker. Something almost sulfurous underneath that I didn't have a clean comparison for. I lifted my light and swept it across the enclosure. Between the 2 dumpsters, in the gap that ran back to the cinder block wall, something moved. My first read was person, upright posture, roughly the height of a tall man, filling most of the space between the bins. My second read, arriving almost immediately behind the first, was that the posture was wrong. The weight was pitched too far forward, the shoulders rounded and drawn in toward the front, the arms hanging too low. The way you might look if you were trying to make yourself smaller while also carrying something heavy across the front of your body. I thought, someone going through the trash, someone in a bad situation, in a lot of layers, maybe impaired. I lowered the light slightly so it wasn't directly in their face and said, "Hey, you doing okay back there?" Nothing. No movement, no response. I brought the light back up. The reason it hadn't responded wasn't because it hadn't heard me. The reason it hadn't responded was because it wasn't a person going through the trash in a bad coat. What I saw in those next few seconds took me a while to accept because my brain kept offering me corrections. That's not fur. That's a dark fabric. It's ripped and dirty, and you're seeing the texture wrong in this light. That's not a muzzle. That's a beard. It's a big guy with a heavy jaw, and you're not seeing it clearly. The corrections kept failing. The surface of what was standing between those 2 dumpsters was not fabric. It moved when it breathed. The whole thing shifted, the way fur shifts over living muscle, not the way clothing shifts over a body. In the patches along the upper arms and belly where it was thin, I could see skin underneath. Not skin like mine, textured differently, darker, the kind of thing you see on the back of a hand that spent decades in weather. The skull was wrong. That's the most precise way I can put it. It was the right general shape for a head, roughly. 2 eyes, a nose, a jaw, but the proportions were off in a way I couldn't immediately identify, and then suddenly could. The face extended forward, not a lot, not like a dog muzzle at full extension, but enough that the nose and the lower jaw sat further front of the eyes than they should have, giving the whole thing a pushed forward density that no person has. The ears were above and behind the eyes, high and pointed, and they moved independently. While its face stayed pointed at me, one ear swung toward the sound of the rooftop unit, the other stayed forward. Then both locked on me. I'd found something on my second camera setup 2 nights earlier that I hadn't been able to explain cleanly. The bait station I'd placed 6 feet from the enclosure wall, a weighted PVC tube anchored with a steel stake, had been moved. Not knocked over, moved deliberately, 3 feet toward the brush. The stake was still in the ground. Whatever moved that station had pulled the tube free from its anchor and carried it. Raccoons don't do that. Bears can do that. But bears don't place things. They knock things over or drag them. This had been set down carefully. I'd filed it as a note to follow up on and hadn't thought about it again until that moment, because what was standing 8 feet from me between those dumpsters had hands. I got the light on them for about 1 second before it shifted. 5 fingers, long, thick through the middle joints, the nails, not claws in the movie sense, not elegant curved talons, but actual nails, dark and heavy and thickened the way hard use makes them, curving down and slightly inward at the tips.
When it adjusted its grip on the edge of the dumpster, I could see the tendons moving under the skin of the back of its hand. That detail is the one my memory's sharpest on. That's the one that collapsed every remaining explanation. That's when I took a step backward. My shoulder hit the corner of the cinder block wall.
The sound came first, before any of it. Low. Not a growl exactly. Too controlled, too deliberate for a growl. More like the sound a large engine makes when it drops a gear to hold position on a hill. It came from its chest, not its throat, and I felt it in my sternum before I consciously registered hearing it. The smell arrived at the same moment I felt that sound. Not because I moved toward it, but because it shifted slightly, one foot repositioning on the concrete, and whatever current of air existed in that enclosure came toward me. I've been in this work long enough to know what decomposition smells like at every stage, what mold smells like, what concentrated animal musk smells like. This was all of those, and something else underneath, something ferrous, almost like copper, like old blood that has dried and then been re-wetted. Not fresh injury, more like a permanent condition, the smell of a body that lives close to other dead things. Its head turned toward me fully then, not quickly, slowly. The way something turns when it's already aware of you and has been for a while, and is only now deciding to acknowledge it. My light caught the eyes. They reflected back flat yellow, the way a raccoon reflects when you hit it right. But these were higher off the ground than any raccoon has any business being, and they were set deep under a brown ridge that cut them into shadow even in my direct beam. They did not blink when the light hit them. They stayed open, and they stayed on me. I tried to make it something I could name. Standing dog on his hind legs? No, the legs were wrong. The knees sat too low. The lower leg had a forward curve inconsistent with canine anatomy. Person in an elaborate costume? I was 6 feet away with a bright light. There was no seam I could find, no edge of a mask, no place where the material started and the skin stopped. The fur along the spine and upper shoulders was raised, each individual hair visible and distinct and moving faintly in the almost absent air. It dropped its weight. Not all the way, not a crouch for attack, a subtle redistribution, hips lowering slightly, shoulders drawing forward another degree, one hand releasing the dumpster edge and coming up and out from its body about 6 inches, fingers spread. It was the posture of something that was assessing, running numbers, deciding whether I was a threat, a target, or an inconvenience. My flashlight was shaking. I could see the beam jittering on the wall above its head. My other hand found my truck keys in my jacket pocket, and my fingers went around them without any instruction from me, pure motor memory reaching for something it could use. It took one step forward. Not two. One. Then it stopped and held that position, and I understood, in the part of my brain that is older than language, that the step had not been accidental. It was a test. It was watching for what I did next. I did nothing. I could not move. A set of headlights swung into the front parking lot. I didn't see them. I heard the tires on the lot surface and the engine note change as the car slowed to park. The sound was completely ordinary and completely irrelevant to anything happening in that enclosure. But it was sound from outside, from the direction of the road, and it broke whatever calculation the thing had been running. Its head moved toward the sound, just the head, neck rotating on those impossible shoulders, ears swinging forward. Then it looked back at me. Then it went. Not running, something lower and faster than running. It dropped from 2 points to 4 in a single motion, not a fall, a controlled descent, and covered the width of the enclosure in 2 strides, clearing the back wall of the cinder block with something I can only call efficiency. By the time I stepped to the opening of the enclosure, it was already in the grass strip between the concrete and the brush, moving low and fast with a gait that used its arms as a forward drive, knuckles not quite touching the ground, but close, its shoulder blades rising and falling in a roll that no dog has and no person has, and that I have not been able to find in any reference since. It hit the brush and was gone. Not immediately gone. For a second, I could see the mass of it above the saplings, the bulk of the back and the high, set ears, and then the branches closed around it, and the dark took the rest. One crack of a branch, deep in, 15 seconds later.
then nothing. I went back to the truck. I sat in it for a while with the windows up and the doors locked, which I recognized as pointless even while I was doing it, because whatever I had just seen would have had no more trouble with a truck door than I would with a cardboard box. I locked the doors anyway. I made myself go back and finish the job, check the cages, empty, sets undisturbed, swap the memory card from the cameras with hands that fumbled more than they should have, pulled both lids down on the dumpsters. The left one, the open one, had damage on the leading edge I hadn't noticed before, a slight upward bend in the corner of the steel lip, and 4 shallow, parallel grooves in the paint that lined up with what I'd seen on those fingers. I ran my thumb along those grooves twice. Then I went home. My wife was already in bed. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and went through the trail cam footage. The first camera had the usual rotation: raccoons, a possum, one feral cat that shows up in almost every trail cam I've ever set in that county. The second card, facing the enclosure directly, had a run of stills from the 20 minutes before I had arrived. One frame, both lids closed, enclosure empty. Next frame, left lid open, tall shape standing between the bins, one arm extended upward in the position of something that has just lifted that lid. I zoomed in until the image dissolved into blocks of color. The infrared had blown out the face into a white smear of motion artifact. The posture read at first glance as a very large man in dark clothing. The longer I looked at it, the less certain I was of that reading. The proportions of the arm were wrong for a person. The shoulder-to-waist ratio was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. Anyone looking at that image cold would say, guy in a hoodie going through the trash. I copied the files to a folder. I did not delete anything. I closed the laptop. I told Phil the next morning that they had a problem with someone accessing the dumpsters and that he needed heavier latches and a lock that required a key to open from the outside. I did not tell him what I'd seen. There was no version of that conversation that ended with me keeping the account. Months passed. The latches Phil installed did their job. The cameras picked up nothing unusual. By the spring, I had almost convinced myself that whatever I had seen had moved on, pushed out by the new hardware or by the narrowing of the food reward, or simply by whatever logic governs the movement of something that doesn't stay in one place. I had almost convinced myself.
Dispatch called me on a Tuesday evening in May. A colleague of mine, I'll call him Mike, had gone out to the grocery account for a routine check. He'd called in when he arrived, logged that he was doing an exterior inspection. After that, nothing. They'd tried his phone. No answer. Could I swing by, check if he was in the truck with his phone dead, make sure everything was okay? When dispatch said the name of the store, something in my stomach moved in a direction I didn't like. I didn't go directly. I drove home first, went to the bedroom safe, checked the magazine on my compact 9mm, racked around, holstered it under my jacket. Then I drove to the store. Mike's truck was in the back lot, empty, doors closed, no Mike. I got out and walked the building with my hand resting on the holster and the big flashlight in my other hand. When I rounded the corner toward the enclosure, the smell told me things had changed. Both lids open, bag split and spread, cardboard pushed against the back wall, drag marks in the damp grit leading toward the brush line. I called Mike's name. The sound of my own voice against that center block was too loud. From somewhere in the scrub, faint and rough, I heard him answer. I found him 100 yards in, curled on his side in a shallow depression. His coveralls were shredded across the torso and left thigh, dark with blood in a way that stopped my breath for a moment. His belt knife was in his hand, blade dark. He looked up into my light and said, "Jason, it was a monster. It looked like a werewolf. I got it with the knife, but it's still out there." I got my arms under him and started moving. We'd covered maybe 6 yards when I heard it. From the left, somewhere in the brush, the same chest-deep, gear-dropping sound I'd heard in October. Not louder, exactly the same. Controlled, patient. Mike's fingers locked around my sleeve. I set him down as carefully as I could, stood up, drew the pistol, and brought the light alongside it. The brush moved in one spot, a shiver of leaves about 50 feet out. Nothing appeared.
The sound moved, tracing a slow arc to the right, recalculating distance. Mike was beyond talking by then. He was just holding my ankle. I fired once into the thicket where the movement was. The sound cut off. I picked up Mike and did not stop moving until we cleared the brush and hit the concrete. We got around the corner of the enclosure wall and into the orange reach of the loading dock lights, and I kept going until we were in front of the store, in full view of the employees who'd come outside when they heard the shot. A woman in a winter coat knelt next to Mike without being asked and pressed her jacket against the worst of it. Mike kept twisting to look back at the loading dock. It still took EMS 4 minutes to arrive. 4 minutes is a long time. When the deputy interviewed me, I told him what I knew they could work with. Large, aggressive animal, probably a feral dog, possibly something from the brush corridor along the creek. Lawful defensive discharge. Mike's version, delivered in fragments from a stretcher while the paramedics worked on him, involved the word werewolf several times. The deputy wrote something on his pad that I didn't try to read. When they walked the brush with flashlights, they found blood on 3 different saplings in a flattened area about 20 feet in where something large had been on the ground. No body, no trail they could follow further than a few yards. The report listed it as an animal attack, unknown species, defensive firearm discharge, case open. Nobody called me about it again. I visited Mike in the hospital on the 3rd day. He looked smaller. He'd lost a significant amount of blood, and they'd done 2 separate surgeries, one for a lateral wound to the torso, one for damage to the left leg that took a while to piece together. He was going to walk fine eventually, they said. It would take time. When the nurse stepped out, he grabbed my wrist and asked if I'd seen it. Not hysterically, quietly. He just needed to know he hadn't lost his mind in addition to everything else. I told him I'd seen it. I told him it was real. I told him he hadn't imagined anything. He let go of my wrist and lay back and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. I thought I was going to die in those trees. I kept thinking about my dog at home. Isn't that stupid? Kept thinking about who was going to walk her. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. He's been through some things since then. Not working in the field anymore. He's on administrative and scheduling. There's nothing wrong with that. It's what he can handle now, and handling what you can is the whole game. As for me, I don't do late-night exterior calls alone anymore. That's not a fear response, or it's not only a fear response, it's just an operational decision. The same way you decide not to work on a live electrical panel by yourself, it's a reasonable accommodation to a demonstrated risk. I've had the rear lot at that store on my drive-by list for the last 6 months, not checking it professionally, just noting it. I can't fully explain why I keep doing that. Maybe I'm expecting something. Maybe I'm hoping for nothing. The fence section Phil had installed on the back perimeter, the new management finally finished in February. Heavy gauge, 8 feet. I don't know if it'll stop anything determined. Probably not. But it changes what's visible from the scrub. And in my experience, animals that use intelligence the way that things seem to use it are sensitive to changes in visibility. They prefer to know what they're walking into. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the size of it, not even what it looked like. The assessment. The way it looked at me in that enclosure and made a decision. The way it circled Mike in the brush instead of committing to a second attack after he'd heard it. The way it appeared at the edge of the enclosure that second night, 30 feet out, deliberate, measured, like it understood where the light ended and the dark began and positioned itself exactly at that line. Animals do not do that, not the way this thing did it. I don't have a clean conclusion for any of this. I don't know what that thing is or how many of them there are or how long they've been using that brush corridor as a transit route. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what I smelled. I know what happened to Mike. Some nights I wake up and I'm fine. Other nights I'm back in that enclosure with the light shaking and the eyes catching the beam and the sound of that calculated, deliberate step on the concrete. The thing I keep coming back to, The thing I can't put down no matter how many times I turn it over is this. It didn't have to stop at one step.
Here's something most people who've researched Dogman encounters at scale don't talk about, because it doesn't fit the horror narrative cleanly. The overwhelming majority of Dogman encounters in the Great Lakes region happen within 200 yards of a food resource: dumpsters, hunting feeders, livestock, fish cleaning stations. These aren't random sightings. They follow a foraging pattern. What makes them different from large predator behavior, what makes researchers like Stan Gordon and Linda Godfrey note them specifically, is the evidence of sustained, location-specific memory. These animals return to the same sites repeatedly over months and sometimes years. They remember what worked. They remember what changed. That's not instinct driving them back. That's something closer to planning. Whatever's out there in those brush corridors running along the creek systems of Northwest Ohio knows the difference between a dumpster with a weak latch and one with a lock. It knows where the lights reach and where they don't. It knows, apparently, that a lone person at the back of a closed building in the dark is a different equation than a parking lot with people. That's the detail that stays with me. Not the fur, not the face, not even what happened to Mike. The detail that stays with me is that it knows the math. If you've had something like this happen, not necessarily what I described, but any experience in the gray zone between what you can explain and what you can't, I want to hear it. This channel exists because these stories need to be told by the people who lived them, not reconstructed by people who didn't. Subscribe and stay close. There are more accounts coming, and some of them are going to change what you think you know about what's out there at the edge of the light.